Um, I'm looking at uh, the newest post from John McWhorter uh, and Glenn Lurie, Anger, Shame, Sadness, and Race in America. And it starts off like this. John and I often talk about how we feel about race in America, but we rarely delve into why we feel the way that we feel. What factors in our lives primed us for these emotional responses? While John and I agree often that about where the politics of race have gone wrong, we just as often experience very different feelings about these matters. Um, I think one of the reasons that I was ultimately, I shouldn't say that. Uh, I was going to say the reason I ultimately moved towards Stoicism was because, uh, in part, of my frustrations with the existential qualities of racial identity and what that means for politics. So, for example, and this was a discussion I was just having this morning with myself. I grew up in Los Angeles, and in LA, and this is in the context of racelessness. LA, we had four black radio stations. So from birth, uh, in the '60s, I knew that there were four choices. There was KJLH, which was originally owned by a guy who ran the Angelus Funeral Home on Crenshaw, big, beautiful Egyptian style building with gold leaf, an institution as distinctive as its name. And so we would be witness to these gigantic funerals with 30, 40, 100 cars and limousines. And that was KGLH, which was later bought by Stevie Wonder, and he changed the names to Kindness, Joy, Love, and Happiness. And that's what that was. It was the number one radio station. But there was also KACE, which was a newer radio station, and they threw concerts in the parks and got big name acts to come into the city and play. And then there were two AM stations, KGFJ and K-Day, KDAY, 1580 K-Day, which was the legendary station that broke from the old format and went hip hop. But even though I had my federal radio with the leather case and I put Dymo label of my favorite DJs on there, I always knew that I had four black choices, all of them slightly different favors. And then within those major four, there were multiple DJs. And so there was J.J. Johnson, I think, was the most popular DJ in the city. But, I learned as a teenager, or maybe, when I went up to hiking in the mountains, you go up past Pasadena and you can't hear any of those radio stations. You're on your own. And so I was just thinking about the people, generally speaking, who take black culture as a racial identifier because they listen to black music that they know is owned by black folks from black radio stations and listening to black musicians play that music. And that's a world. And it's a world that you can adopt to uh, and claim it. But if you happen to be Michael Bowen, your father is Robert T. Bowen, who founds the Institute for Black Studies and heads on this tangent called cultural black nationalism. And so even before there was black, we were born Negroes. And he comes from New Haven, Connecticut, comes out here to LA, starts this institute, starts writing for the black newspaper, and establishing this new black nationalism. And I have the distinction, which I think is a lucky one, which is that I understood there's something as a Negro, there's some cultural production that's out there to be consumed that you kind of can get your black identity from because, like all of us, we lack the internal poetry to sing songs by Marvin Gaye and start our romances, quoting those lyrics. But if you start off with something brand new, like Kwanzaa instead of Christmas, then you are willing, or at least, I was to say, oh, okay, maybe this is the black way to go. Maybe this is the future. And I was always oriented towards the future because I wanted to be an astronaut. But what I'm ultimately saying here is that as my father decided it was better to be a middle class father than to be a black radical marching in the streets and hanging out with the Black Panthers and other groups like that, that you could just come and go out of this blackness, which I understood as an intellectual creation from the go. I mean, if you're reading Liberator magazine or Freedom Ways magazine, you know that there are writers and poets out there who are trying to create this black consciousness and this black culture from their own minds, from their own philosophies, from their own life lessons. And sometimes it sticks and sometimes it doesn't. You have to compete with other poets, priests, and politicians, to quote Sting. And they don't always win. And sometimes you have to weigh that advantage versus the disadvantage, and how does it actually work in the real world. So when black separatism and going to another country to be free of America doesn't work, then you have to try an alternative strategy. And if you're hanging on to what DJ JJ Johnson says on the radio, you may have a lot of company, but you're not necessarily testing that independently. You're not testing the meaning of that blackness, the effectiveness of that blackness. And so, by the 70s, we were all about crossover. We were no longer the Commodores, we were Lionel Richie. And then new radio stations came in, and there was a McDonald's that was black owned, and there was crossover. And that was a real part of my growing up. And so when I look at McWhorter and Lowry this morning, there is an emotional detachment that I have from all of this. It's kind of like, well, these are the things that people go through, and these are the politics that they adopt. This is the religion they adopt. This is the schooling and educational philosophy that they adopt, and some of it works and some of it doesn't work. And yeah, you can call it all black, but there's not a discipline around that is shared by everybody. If that were the truth, if that were shared by all African Americans, then we would all belong to the same church. There wouldn't be an AME or a Southern Baptist or a Pentecostal or a Seventh-day Adventist or a Church of God in Christ. There wouldn't be jazz, there wouldn't be hip-hop, there wouldn't be gospel, there wouldn't be blues, there wouldn't be R&B, there wouldn't be rap, there wouldn't be wild style, there wouldn't be funk. It would just all be black music. And it would all have the same flavor, and it would all have the same implication, and it would all mean the same thing to everybody who participates. And that's ridiculous. It's been ridiculous. It's always been ridiculous. So why people are so eager to reduce all that complexity and those multiple tangents to race has just been always foolishness. And I've recognized, even as I was participating to try to get everybody to sing the Black National Anthem as a young Black nationalist teenager, I realized, there's only so far you can push. And I recognize the fervor, the evangelistic fervor of people who have been woke, or whatever they called it in those days, when they go to the movie theater and they see Three the Hard Way or Shaft in Africa, and they're like, we really can beat the white man. And there are black folks who are afraid of white folks, who don't trust them, who can't establish real relationships with them. And there are always these remnants of these outdated ideas that have been proven wrong that show up. There's always going to be new folks who are new to new environments. When I was in school the second time, We're always looking at the first generation college students and what it's like for them to be in a college environment and catering to that. And there are things, there are paths that are well worn that are new to other people. So I think we're always going to do that, and in the larger scale, humanity is always going to do that. So there is a real understanding I have, and a kind of an emotional detachment I have from the various tangents and tactics that black folks, believe are vital to their liberation, or to their life in America, or to their self sufficiency and their dignity and their sanity. So people are going to choose different paths, and you just can't, even if you could believe seriously and honestly that there is a white supremacist agenda, you can't possibly believe that black unity is the solution to that. Because if if all the white supremacists have one rope and you unify yourself, well, then they don't have to chase you around. All the black people will be at the black meeting in this one black shack, and they can burn that one shack down, and that's the final solution. But it's much harder if blacks are scattered, if blacks don't have Jim Crow laws, and they're integrated into society in ways that are untraceable as black. So that is kind of what to me is a common sense explanation about not being overly concerned about what happens, specifically to black tactics and strategies and identities and educations and consciousnesses, because it's always evolving. I mean, I can't even talk about Mahalia Jackson, and if I talk about Billie Holiday, people are just going to talk about two songs, without understanding anything about what Billie Holiday sung. And when you've heard 50 Billie Holiday songs, and all everybody wants to talk about is Strange Fruit, then you're like, okay, you understand that every black cultural icon can be symbolic of X, and these days, X is all about victimhood and suffering and failure, and it's tiresome. I don't have time to deal with that. It's not productive, despite how much of an audience that has across all Americans. So, I think anybody, for their mental sanity, has to tamp down what I call Eclexia. And Eclexia, and black Eclexia. But Eclexia means this unnatural attraction to the eclectic. Instead of sticking to a principle, it's like you're listening to the radio DJ on Friday night during the 80s when they announce all of these bands in all of these clubs all over town. So you hear these names of bands that you've never heard of, and these clubs that you've never been to, but the DJ who's saying that is very excited about, the Flying Turds at Madame Wong's West, and the Juvenile Delinquents at the Palomino, and it just goes on for half an hour. And it's the same thing with movies and TV and all other kinds of entertainments and stuff I get in my inbox. It's just like, here's all these wonderful, magical things that you need to complete your life. And it's like, no, dude, I'm philosophically stabilized. I mean, I better be at my age. So, yeah, overall, I feel like I am immune to the emotional drain, and stress of watching failure that goes in the name of black, and the fervor and the churn that goes over it. I think it's most important to put a principled position down, be clear about it, and be responsive to it as people ask questions. And that's all I think my public responsibility is just to be consistent and say, hey, whatever you think, here's what I think, and here's what works, and here's why. And that explaining job is a teaching job. It's part of writing, which I enjoy doing anyway. I mean, it's at least it's writing in response to people's genuine curiosity, and it has the same value as teaching. And it's sad as times go up and down, and people, more or less ask stupider questions, or questions that ultimately have stupid assumptions. And yeah, I think it's self-evident as far as I'm concerned that people are more color-struck and more racially conscious for no good reason than they were 10 years ago. So, and of course, it bears mentioning that I think this is all politicized, and but that's another tangent. We could cover that another time. So emotionally, yeah, I'm stable. I deal with this stoically, and stoicism is a good help to maintain my level-headedness through all this madness. That is all.